Welcome to a journey through time where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. The world outside your window is quiet now. The air's a little cooler, your blanket a little warmer, and your mind, well, it's ready to slip somewhere between curiosity and calm. So let's go back. Not just a few decades or even a few centuries, but over 1,000 years. You find yourself standing in a dim but bustling hall, lit by flickering rushlights. The walls are timbered tapestries, half hide the drafts, and the scent of old wool beeswax and roasted barley drifts past your nose. You are in Wessex. It's the 890s. You're here to meet a child named Æthelstan. He isn't king yet, not even close. Right now, he's just a clever, observant boy being raised in a court filled with cloaked counselors, harp-strumming monks, and the faint rumble of war news. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and a local time. I love seeing where you're listening from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're just tall enough to peek over the edge of the carved bench. Æthelstan, the small boy beside you, doesn't fidget like the others. His eyes fixate on the older man speaking Latin a little too slowly at the end of the hall. There's no sparkle in the speech, just the dull thud of duty. But Æthelstan watches anyway, lips moving slightly, mimicking the words. He's a grandson of Alfred the Great. And while you'd expect some pampering, this isn't exactly the stuff of golden cradles. Æthelstan isn't raised at Edward the Elder's royal court, but at the one in Mercia, his aunt Æthelflaed's realm. And here in Mercia, the rules are slightly different. It's quieter, harder, more layered in suspicion. Æthelflaed is no token aunt. She's the famed Lady of the Mercians, and depending on whom you ask, she's the real power behind the southern English frontier. Her husband Ethelred is nominally in charge, but he's unwell. You see him once hunched over in a corner, coughing into a cloth he tucks quickly away. He won't be long in this world, so Æthelstan grows in the in-between. Neither fully Wessex nor truly Mercian, he's learning diplomacy through silence and posture. You watch as he's trained in Latin psalters by candlelight, then in swordplay in the mud. They teach him poetry and posture, but also how to size up a man at 20 paces, how to fold a charter, and which relic to kiss first when entering a monastery. The boy's eyes give him away. He stares not just with curiosity, but with calculation, something you've seen only in people who understand they may one day have to command others. There's a small wooden box under his bed. You peek. Inside is a belt, unremarkable really, until you learn the legend later. Supposedly it was Alfred the Great who gave it to Æthelstan along with the sword and a copy of the Psalms. A symbolic coronation kit, decades before the crown ever touches his head. Some historians say this tale is sweet propaganda, another attempt to retrofit Æthelstan's importance after the fact. Others believe it sincerely pointing to old annals with carefully inked notes in the margins. And then there are those who suspect Æthelflaed herself crafted the story building a mythos for her nephew like a bedtime story with political clause. Whatever the truth, Æthelstan holds the objects with reverence. You see him polishing the belt in silence, murmuring lines from the Psalter like charms. He's not just memorizing the words, he's absorbing the cadence of power. Outside things are changing. The Danelaw still stretches across the north, a jagged wound of Norse control dividing England. Edward the Elder. Æthelstan's father rules Wessex, but the rest of the country is still a messy patchwork of half-tamed territories, half-resigned kings, and very real Viking threats. Yet, Æthelstan doesn't speak much of war. He listens. When riders come bearing news from the front, he stands behind the curtain and hears everything. You're beside him once when he listens to an ealdorman's tale of burnt monasteries, and you feel his hand clench ever so slightly, but he says nothing. There's a peculiar rhythm to his education. Morning prayers, afternoon sword drills, evening readings. And once a week, always the same day, he's brought a scroll covered in names, alliances, feuds. Æthelflaed points to it and says, "Know these men. One day you'll need to know whom not to trust." The boy nods. You wonder if he fully understands. He's still young, but there's something unsettling about how little he ever forgets. Fringe fact: once during a summer thunderstorm, Æthelstan reportedly refused to come inside the hall, insisting on reciting psalms under the lightning, because David feared no giant. A servant said the boy caught a fever for days. Others say it never happened. Either way, it sounds exactly like something he'd do. And speaking of fringes, there's a monk at court who claims Æthelstan once saw a vision of a burning city somewhere far to the north, surrounded by ships with dragon heads. Nobody knows what to make of it. Some say it's a metaphor. Others wonder if the boy simply had an overcooked dinner and a wild dream. Either way, the seed is planted. Æthelstan learns the land by shadow and map. He memorizes rivers before roads, abbots before barons. And more than anything, he watches the way people move when they think no one is looking. It's this quiet foundation that will one day allow him to unite a realm without raising his voice. But for now, he's just a boy polishing a sword he's too young to wield, whispering prayers he may one day enforce by law. Historians still argue whether Æthelstan was always meant to be king, or if fortune and politics opened the throne to him unexpectedly. But tonight, watching the boy sleep under wool blankets and whisper lines from the Psalter into the dark, you can't help but feel he's already rehearsing. You wake to frost on the window panes and the distant toll of a monastery bell. Æthelstan is already up. He's kneeling by a flickering taper fingers moving along worn parchment. But today, something in the air feels brittle, like the stillness before a storm. There's tension in the halls, a scent of pine smoke and whispers. His father, Edward the Elder, is dead. The news comes not with trumpets, but through a pale messenger with dust in his beard. Edward's death is not unexpected. He was no young man, but what follows it throws the court into a soft panic. You can feel it in the way servants carry platters too quickly and how the scribes suddenly write shorter letters. Æthelstan looks at you with wide, unreadable eyes. He is not the only heir. Edward leaves behind a nest of sons. Half-brothers, most of them sons from different mothers raised in different courts, and each with his own entourage of loud-talking, land-hungry nobles. The crown of Wessex does not pass gently like a cup at dinner. It must be claimed, defended, sometimes bartered for, sometimes seized. You travel with Æthelstan and his Mercian allies to Gloucester, a place of muted colors and heavy stone. Word spreads that Æthelstan may take the throne of Mercia, first an odd twist given his roots. But this is no ordinary kingdom. The Mercians have long memories, and some of them still view Wessex as a southern upstart. Yet Æthelstan, he grew up among them. They remember his kindness to elders, his quick wit, the way he never lorded his lineage over them. There's a quiet vote, more gesture than formal, and just like that, Æthelstan becomes king of Mercia. Not yet of all England, but the first step is taken. Not everyone is happy. His younger half-brother Elfward, backed by some Wessex lords, is proclaimed king there. 2 kings, 1 crown, and you're in the middle. It's hard to say what Æthelstan is thinking. He gives no speeches, makes no proclamations. But the next morning you find him in the chapel holding Alfred's Psalter again. He's whispering a line, Dominus regit me et nihil mihi dirit. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Then word reaches you. Elfward is dead. Just a few weeks into his reign, some say, from illness, others from the sharp edge of ambition. There's no proof, of course, only silence and the faintest smell of smoke. Historians still argue whether Elfward died naturally or if someone gently assisted the process. There are no witnesses, no records of foul play, just the neat vacuum left behind. And so by late 924, Æthelstan is alone in the race. But even then, the Wessex nobles stall. They hesitate. Murmur, delay. Some question whether a Mercian-raised boy can truly rule them. He may be Edward's son, but he doesn't feel like theirs. You travel to Winchester for the coronation, but it doesn't happen. Not there. The city resists. You hear things. Nobles complaining that Æthelstan is too friendly with Mercia, that he doesn't smile enough, that he carries himself more like a monk than a warlord. The wine flows thinner in Winchester that week. Instead, Æthelstan is crowned in Kingston upon Thames, a quiet compromise, the place where Wessex meets Mercia, a symbolic midpoint for a king who must straddle two histories. You're there standing beneath a cloudy sky as bishops chant and nobles shuffle their boots in the damp grass. It's not a coronation of pomp. There are no soaring cathedrals or rivers of coin. But there is power in the simplicity. Æthelstan kneels is anointed and stands a king not just of Wessex or Mercia, but of a place soon to be called England. And yet not everyone falls in line. Some nobles retreat to their shires muttering about the boy with foreign ways. Others simply wait to see what happens. Æthelstan returns to his hall and begins the real work not of celebrating but of holding the crown in place. Fringe detail. One tale claims that during the coronation banquet a hawk flew down and landed on Æthelstan's shoulder, refusing to leave. It's said the bird stayed for 3 days eating scraps from the king's table and perching beside him during prayers, a sign they whispered, or perhaps just a hungry bird. Another less quoted tale says Æthelstan took no feast at all, choosing instead to eat alone in silence with a monk. Possibly nonsense. Possibly both are true. Back in the royal chamber, you see Æthelstan standing in front of a mirror of polished bronze. He studies his reflection like a puzzle. He's wearing a new tunic, rich blue embroidered with lions, and he looks for the first time fully like a king. But you know better. He's still the boy who listened behind curtains. Still the boy who learned silence before command. Only now the stakes are higher. Messengers arrive hourly now. A bishop from Canterbury, a lord from Kent, a warning from the Danelaw. Everyone wants something. Everyone expects this young king to make his move. And he does, but not with war. Not yet. Instead, Æthelstan sends gifts. Letters. Coins with his face on them. He begins to shape his image not just through conquest, but through craft. One by one, the hesitant nobles begin to thaw, but you feel it in your bones this peace will not last. Not with the North still under Norse rule, not with whispers from Scotland, not with uneasy lords who change allegiance with the tide. Still tonight you rest in the king's new court. The rushes are clean, the fire is warm, and Æthelstan, your quiet, thoughtful boy, is now a crowned king, and the crown fits. For now. It's early morning again, and the king is already awake. Æthelstan doesn't sleep in like other monarchs you've read about. No decadent lounging in silken beds, no drowsy indulgence in wine or poetry recitals before breakfast. Instead, he's seated cross-legged on a bench, his fingers curled around the cover of a psalter. Its old leather, worn thin corners bent. This is the same book they say that Alfred the Great gave him as a boy. You watch him run his thumb along the edge of the page where the gold leaf has long since flaked away. This, along with a sword and a golden belt, supposedly came from his grandfather. A sort of starter pack for kingship, or perhaps just a story someone made up to sell his reign as destiny. Historians still argue whether Alfred actually bestowed these gifts upon Æthelstan, or whether the tale emerged from the royal spin room, crafted years after when the boy had become a man and the man had become a legend. The earliest accounts of the story don't appear until decades after Æthelstan's death, which makes things suspicious. And yet there's the Psalter. It exists. The belt might even exist. The sword gone likely rusted to dust or spirited away into some northern treasure hoard. But the idea of it lives on. Æthelstan treats these objects not like talismans, but like old friends. The Psalter is filled with marginalia in multiple hands. Latin notes, odd markings, even a few stray musical notations. A monk who once taught him claimed that young Æthelstan could recite the entire thing by heart before he was 15. You're not sure if that's true, but you've certainly heard him mutter verses while sharpening his blade. And that blade, you finally get to see it. Slim, almost delicate for a king's weapon. But there's a sharpness to it you don't doubt for a second. Æthelstan wears it not as a symbol, but as a tool, like a carpenter with a trusted chisel. He's also got that belt now, the gold one, rumored to have Alfred's seal stitched into the lining. Except when you sneak a closer glance, it doesn't really look like gold. More like gilded brass. And the stitching, not especially royal. It might have been refashioned from a bishop's ceremonial sash, actually. Still, it sparkles enough in candlelight to convince a nervous ealdorman. That's the point, isn't it? Æthelstan understands symbols. He knows how to stage a room, how to arrange a charter's phrasing so his name flows a little more regally than the line above it. You find that he's begun signing his name with a growing list of titles. King of the Anglo-Saxons, Basileus of the English by God's grace, defender of all Britain. Some of it's in Latin, some of it's in bold, blocky Anglo-Saxon. All of it is very deliberate. One charter you notice is addressed to a monastery not yet built. Æthelstan is already planning ahead, not just for his reign, but for his memory. But don't think he's alone in this effort. There's a coterie around him now. Clever scribes, silver-tongued abbots, ambitious bishops. One of them, a wiry old man with ink-stained hands, insists that Æthelstan's image be placed on every new coin minted. A king's face should greet his people before his words do, he says. So, for the first time in England's patchwork history, silver pennies bearing a true portrait of the monarch begin to circulate. Æthelstan's hair is a bit more flowing than in real life, and his nose suspiciously straight. The crown looks heavier than anything you've seen him wear. You suspect the engraver took liberties. Still, it works. Merchants accept these coins with a little more awe. Peasants pass them from hand to hand, whispering of the new king who rules both Wessex and Mercia. Even in northern markets where Viking influence still lingers like smoke, Æthelstan's name starts to appear on tally records and grain shipments. Fringe detail. One batch of Æthelstan coins appears to feature a backwards inscription, his name reversed like a mirror. Likely a minting error, but rumors fly that it's some kind of hidden message or divine omen. A few coins are kept in shrines as relics. Most are just spent at market for cabbage. Another curious document turns up a charter supposedly issued to a monastery that never existed. The names are odd. A brother Elfdrink and sister Wigbald. Likely a forgery made by a later abbot to claim tax exemptions. Still, it bears Æthelstan's seal or a passable imitation of it. and has been used to justify land ownership disputes even centuries later. You're beginning to see that kingship for Æthelstan is less about sitting on a throne and more about managing perception. A document here, a coin there, a carefully chosen relic, a revised genealogy. He doesn't claim descent only from Edward or Alfred. Oh no. He starts reaching back, linking his bloodline, however dubiously, to biblical kings, to Trojan heroes, even to the Roman emperors. His scribes scribble, his priests chant, and slowly the story of Æthelstan becomes bigger than the man himself. But there's a cost to this. At night, when the court is quiet and only the mice scurry between rushes, you see him pacing. He runs a hand through his hair, not the grand mane from the coin, but short and still damp from washing. You hear him speak softly. What good is law if they forget the face? Historians today still question what drove Æthelstan. Was it ambition, duty, insecurity? Did he fear obscurity in a world where kings were forgotten with frightening speed? Or was he simply building what he thought England needed? A figure strong enough to unify a land, yet pliable enough to reshape his legend. You think of his Psalter again, pages worn yet still turning. The boy who read by taper light is now crafting his own gospel. One coin, one charter, one belt-polishing anecdote at a time. The morning sun slices through the slits in the shutters, and already the court is awake with anticipation. Today is no ordinary day. It is the day Æthelstan is crowned king, not just of Mercia, not just of Wessex, but as one hopeful bishop puts it, with a well-rehearsed flourish of all the English. Though all might be a touch optimistic, you travel with a royal party to Kingston-upon-Thames, a modest town on the border of Wessex and Mercia. Symbolism oozes from its muddy streets. It's the perfect compromise, neither north nor south, neither an old Roman capital nor a brash new city. Just neutral enough to please almost no one. Perfect for a political balancing act. You're standing under gray clouds, your feet cold from morning dew, when Æthelstan steps into view. His cloak is thick wool dyed with woad, trimmed in dark fur. No glittering golden robes, no imperial purple. Just a practical king dressed like a warlord who's cleaned up for the day. The archbishop lifts the oil and the ritual begins. The anointing is quiet, reverent, almost understated, no trumpets. No spontaneous dove sightings. Æthelstan kneels on a small platform, wooden, a little uneven, and bows his head. There's a curious hush over the crowd, the kind that isn't quite reverence, more like measured hesitation. The nobles are watching each other more than the ceremony. No one wants to clap too early. You realize then this is not a coronation filled with loyalty. It's a coronation filled with calculation. When the crown, simple, undecorated, is placed on Æthelstan's head, you can almost hear the unspoken thoughts. Let's see how long he lasts. You glance at the faces of the powerful men around you. Some show polite interest, some scowl openly. And one, you don't know his name, but you notice his ring glinting in the light, actually yawns. Still it's done. Æthelstan rises. The king of the Anglo-Saxons. The first to be crowned with both Wessex and Mercian allegiance. And while his coronation title doesn't yet include King of England, you feel the room shift slightly, as if the world is just beginning to consider the idea. Historians still debate whether this coronation marked the beginning of England as a unified kingdom, or if it was just another stop along a much messier road. Some argue the real unity came years later. Others insist it began here on this damp morning in Kingston, with a young man wearing a modest crown and a heavy sense of purpose. You follow Æthelstan into the hall afterward. There's no raucous feast. Instead, there's bread meat and a quiet meal where everyone watches their wine cups more than their food. Æthelstan eats slowly. When a bishop raises a toast to the realm eternal, the room doesn't quite know whether to cheer or nod grimly. You'd expect celebration, but what you get is tension wrapped in ceremony. Fringe detail. According to a monastic letter written years later, one guest tripped over a dog during the meal and spilled wine onto Æthelstan's robes. The dog, apparently named Bluntnose, was a gift from a Welsh chieftain. The wine stain was never fully removed and became something of an inside joke in court for months. Another strange detail. There's a rumor that the crown used in the ceremony was borrowed from a cathedral treasury, no less, and never officially returned. It vanishes from record shortly after reappearing only in vague poetic references to a ghost gold diadem. But the moment that lingers in your memory isn't grand at all. It's later, much later, when the guests have drifted away and the servants have begun clearing the platters. You see Æthelstan alone in the chapel, hands clasped, crown removed and set beside him on the stone floor. He's praying, or maybe just thinking. Either way, he doesn't move for a long time. You wonder if he's replaying every step of the day, every glance, every delay, every forced smile from a reluctant lord. You wonder if he hears the silent test they've all set for him. Prove you're more than the boy with books. Prove you can rule. Because though he's been crowned, Æthelstan is still on trial, and he knows it. That evening, a group of young nobles test his resolve. They raise an issue about land grants, something petty but loaded with precedent. Æthelstan listens. Then, in a voice quiet enough to make them lean in, he answers with a reference to a law his grandfather passed. Not only does he quote it, he cites the exact clause. One noble coughs, another reddens. The matter dies on the vine. The message is clear, this is not a ceremonial king. Still, the opposition remains. Letters begin arriving from the north, carefully worded, wrapped in formalities, but oozing disdain. The Norse Gael kings of Dublin and York don't recognize Æthelstan. They send no tribute. The Scots offer congratulations so vague you could mistake them for sarcasm. And the Welsh, they wait. Always watching, always weighing. You ask Æthelstan half in jest if he plans to invade them all. He doesn't laugh. No, he says they'll come to me eventually. Then he turns back to a letter he's drafting. Not to a king, but to a monastery. He's arranging the delivery of relics, finger bones, cloth scraps, small ivory boxes, gifts to buy loyalty from the one group that doesn't march with spears the church. Clever. He knows exactly how to mix piety and power. That night, as the candles burn low, you see him standing by the river. No guards, no advisors. Just Æthelstan the water and the faint ripple of the future. He's not smiling, but he is ready. The wind shifts as you move north. Not just in temperature, though. The air does feel colder as the fields grow broader, and the accent stranger, but politically too. Æthelstan has been crowned, yes, but the title King of the English doesn't mean much if the North doesn't recognize it. And the North, oh, the North is not in a hurry to welcome him. You ride beside the king's company through Mercia toward the River Trent, where boundaries blur between Æthelstan's realm and that nebulous territory still loyal to Norse kings, Celtic warlords, and whoever happens to be holding York that season. The Danelaw is less a kingdom and more a shifting mosaic of loyalties, and most of them don't involve Æthelstan. Still, he presses forward. The road to political dominance is not paved in bodies, not yet. Æthelstan knows better than to strike too soon. Instead, he uses what his aunt Æthelflæd taught him: presence. Not force, but form. Not war, but witness. And so he begins a tour. You watch as he stops in Burr's fortified towns built by his father and grandfather, and listens to complaints from dusty reeves and nervous thanes. He doesn't interrupt. He barely speaks except to ask names, locations, kin. He's making a map in his mind, and it's not just of geography, it's of people. Who to trust? Who grumbles when taxes are mentioned? Who reaches for their sword hilt when a stranger enters the room? In Chester, he visits the old Roman walls and walks the perimeter silently. They say he stops and touches one particular stone worn mossy, older than even the Saxons. Nothing stands unless it's watched, he mutters. You wonder if he's quoting something or someone. The Mercians, at least, are warming to him. After all, he was raised among them. Some call him the second son of Æthelflæd. They remember the boy who paid respects at her funeral, who stood in silent honor when the lady of the Mercians was buried with no crown, but all the loyalty in the world. But Wessex remains twitchy, and Northumbria. That's a walled garden with thorns and snakes inside. King Sitric rules there, a Norse Gael monarch with a Christian wife, and a very unchristian view of southern kings. Which is why Æthelstan does something entirely unexpected. He marries his sister, well offers her in marriage to Sitric. Now you're sitting in a chilly hall in Tamworth, watching the most awkward royal wedding you've ever attended. Sitric, lean and sharp-eyed, shifts in his ceremonial robe like it's made of nettles. Æthelstan, in contrast, is calm composed. His sister Edith, or perhaps Edgith, no one seems quite sure, says little. This union is a calculated risk. Æthelstan is gambling that by marrying his sister to Sitric, he might bind Northumbria to the southern crown, not with chains but with family. For a moment, you think it might work, and for a moment, it does. Sitric even converts to Christianity, sort of. A quick splash of holy water, a few carefully worded vows, and the bishop looks satisfied. Æthelstan offers gifts land, silver, perhaps even a nice little border fortress or two. Sitric smiles, but not with his eyes. Fringe Fact 1 later legend claims Sitric had a condition that he could keep a raven banner woven with runes above York's gate. Æthelstan agreed so long as the bird's wings never faced south. Symbolic borders, you suppose, are better than no borders at all. Another tale, a monk in Winchester, writes that Æthelstan sent a spy dressed as a bard to Sitric's court after the wedding just to listen. The bard's name, Leofwine of Lute. Probably fiction, but you like the idea of Æthelstan mixing espionage with poetry? But then Sitric dies. Just a year or two after the wedding. Illness, poison, battle, wound reopened. No one knows, but the marriage tie unravels fast, and now Northumbria's loose again, like a ship unmoored drifting back toward chaos. Æthelstan doesn't panic. He acts quickly, quietly, and without a declared war. He moves north and takes York. No siege, no bloodbath, just momentum and timing. The Norse elites are leaderless, fractured. Æthelstan walks in and claims it. Suddenly, he's not just king in the south, he controls the north too. For the first time, one man rules all Anglo-Saxon territories in what will later be called England. Historians still argue whether this moment, Æthelstan's occupation of York, marks the true birth of a unified English kingdom. Some say yes, pointing to coinage, law, and territory. Others argue that unity enforced through opportunistic grabs isn't really unity at all. You watch him sit in the York throne hall, which still smells faintly of Norse mead and old moss. Æthelstan wears no new crown, no fanfare. He simply calls for scribes and begins writing letters to the Welsh princes, the Scots kings, and the lords of Strathclyde. The tone firm. Not threatening, but unmistakably superior. He signs them as King of the English. No longer just a claim, now a statement of fact. Fringe anecdote or record from a Welsh monastery claims Æthelstan once sent a gift of silk gloves and a jar of preserved figs to a minor prince as a gentle reminder of loyalty. The monk notes the figs were sour and no further message was needed. The gloves oddly survive. Or at least a pair claimed to be those gloves sits in a dusty cathedral cabinet today. Are they real? Who knows? But the story fits. And so back in your chambers, you hear a courtier whisper, "We might finally have a real king." You glance at Ethelstan's map. The pins and marks stretch from Cornwall to the far edges of Northumbria. He's drawing not just boundaries, but a nation. But as you look closer, you see arrows too. North, west, even some curling back toward the sea. This king has land, but he knows that land is only safe if the neighbors stay quiet. And neighbors, they never stay quiet for long. It begins with the clink of silver and the scratch of quills. Æthelstan has no time to rest on the laurels of conquest. Now that York is his and the Welsh lords nod politely at his letters, if not too eagerly, the real work begins convincing everyone that he belongs where he's sitting. And that takes more than swords and sermons. It takes paperwork. You find yourself in a small chamber that smells of ink and sheep vellum. The windows are narrow slits open just enough to let in a breeze and an occasional whiff of the stable below. A cluster of royal scribes is hunched over desks, writing at speeds that border on supernatural. You spot at least 3 different styles of handwriting, one narrow and spiky, another looping and dramatic, and one suspiciously shaky like the scribe was being jostled by a goat. These men are producing charters, dozens of them. Some grant land to abbeys, others outline legal rights. A few are pure royal PR. All of them are signed in Æthelstan's name with the full flourishing title, Æthelstan Rex Totius Britannius, King of all Britain. He's not being subtle. At the same time, Æthelstan launches a coinage reform. You visit the mint where sweaty men hammer small discs of silver into shape beneath flickering torches. For the first time, these coins are standardized across all of England. The weight is more consistent, the silver purer, and most importantly, each one bears his face. Not just a crown now, he's added a scepter, and a new inscription hinting at his divine right. The messages are clear: I'm not just a warlord, I'm ordained, I'm legitimate, I am permanent. Fringe fact: one batch of coins minted in Winchester has a peculiar detail. Æthelstan's crown appears to have tiny animal heads at each point. Some say lions. Some say they're meant to be dragons. One monk claims they're poorly imagined hedgehogs. We may never know the truth. You start noticing these coins in market stalls, monasteries, and even in the hands of Norse merchants. It's working. The king's image is becoming omnipresent. A kind of soft power jingling in the pouches of butchers and bishops alike. And there's more. Æthelstan commissions law codes, lengthy ones. Not just about theft or murder, but about coin clipping, Sabbath breaking, and even how many times a slave must attend a church spoiler. It's a lot. You listen as clerks read them aloud to gathered crowds, many of whom nod blankly, probably only understanding half of it. Still, the message sticks. This is a king who cares about order, about structure, about reminding you who's in charge even when he isn't in the room. Historians still argue whether Æthelstan's flood of laws and coins was about genuine reform or just a coordinated propaganda campaign. Maybe both, maybe neither. One scholar even suggested Æthelstan was England's first bureaucratic king. Another said he was just good at micromanagement. Potato potato. Meanwhile, you spot something peculiar. Æthelstan is sending gifts, lots of them, to monasteries, to foreign rulers, to nobles he doesn't trust but wants to keep close. There's one particularly lavish package that goes to a Frankish duke, fine cloaks, golden bracelets, and oddly a collection of manuscripts bound in walrus ivory. This king knows how to buy loyalty in bulk. And then there's the spin. You attend a court session where a scribe reads aloud a new charter, and the way Æthelstan is described borders on poetry. He's called Light of the English, Scourge of Pagans, Shield of Christendom. One bit even refers to him as the Mirror of Kings. which sounds impressive until you realize a mirror reflects things, and not all reflections are flattering. Still, the audience claps. Even the grumpiest Ealdorman manages a grunt of approval. Fringe Anecdote One account suggests Æthelstan once gifted an entire herd of white cattle to a cathedral as thanks for copying a psalter. The cows reportedly wandered off before they arrived, only two making it to the gate. They were renamed Psalm and Verse. Back at court, you see how carefully Æthelstan is cultivating his image. He sits for portraits not painted but embroidered. Tapestries begin to circulate with depictions of his battles, his saints and his crown gleaming just so. Most of these are likely exaggerated. In one, Æthelstan is shown wrestling a wolf. You were there. That never happened. Still, the people believe, and that's enough. Even his signature evolves. Where once it was simple, now it sprawls across charters like a banner. You see new phrases creeping in Rex Pacificus, the peaceful king. Per Dei gratiam, by the grace of God. And you begin to understand the genius of it. Æthelstan isn't just ruling, he's curating a myth in real time. He's designing a king the way a mason designs a cathedral brick by brick, detail by detail, knowing that someday people will stare up at the structure and forget the scaffolding that once held it together. At night, you find him alone again, reviewing a pile of documents by candlelight. You ask him if he ever tires of it, the scribes, the coins, the posturing. He doesn't look up. If they believe the law, they obey the law, he says softly. If they believe the king, they obey the king. It's the same ink. You leave him to his ink and his thoughts. Outside, a beggar shows you a silver penny with Æthelstan's face on it. Looks a bit like my uncle, he jokes. You nod and drop another into his hand. The joke works because everyone knows the face now. There's a sudden uptick in the smell of spice at court. Incense, foreign oils, a dash of clove in the wine, tiny markers that something new is stirring. And when you spot the guards tightening their tunics and brushing the dust from their boots, you realize visitors are coming. Not just visitors, royalty. Æthelstan's court is about to get a bit more crowded, a bit more perfumed, and a great deal more complicated. The first wave of foreign emissaries arrives without fanfare, just a quiet procession of cloaks, carved staffs, and polished boots that don't seem to fit the dirt roads of England. They speak French mostly, a little Latin, and a few of them manage a charmingly awkward Godric bless thee in thick accents. These men come from Frankish realms, from Burgundy, from Aquitaine. Some represent counts and dukes. Others bear the crests of kings. One particularly sunburned fellow claims to be an envoy of the Pope, but his scroll has enough smudges to make that claim flexible. Why are they here? Because Æthelstan has a secret weapon, sisters. 5 of them, maybe 6. Records get fuzzy, but Æthelstan, unmarried himself, has royal sisters of marrying age, and that makes him a player in the dynastic chessboard of Europe. Marriage isn't just about romance, it's the medieval version of a non-aggression pact, sealed with wine and mutual awkwardness. And so the suitors come. You're in the great hall when one of them, Louis, a Frankish prince with polished teeth and a distracting lisp, makes his case. He bows low, presents a brooch shaped like a swan, and declares that he dreams of an Anglo rose blooming in his hall. It's awful. You see Æthelstan's left eyebrow twitch, but he doesn't laugh. He nods politely and sends for wine. Eventually, Æthelstan agrees to multiple marriage alliances. One sister goes to the court of Otto the Saxon in East Francia. Yes, that Otto who'll one day become Holy Roman Emperor. Another sister is sent to Hugh the Great in France. Another to a prince in the Low Countries. Æthelstan is planting seeds. Quiet ones, but potent. Fringe fact, in one later tale, Otto reportedly receives Æthelstan's sister, along with an entire menagerie, falcons, greyhounds, and a snow-white peacock. The bird terrified the monks who believed it was an omen of eternal winter. And that's not the only gift exchange happening. Æthelstan also becomes a collector. Of relics, yes, but more interestingly, of books. You watch as crates arrive from all over the continent, illuminated gospels from Gaul, philosophical treatises from Italy, even a half-finished bestiary that includes a rather cheerful sketch of a hedgehog. In one box is a sword gifted from a Frankish courtier. The blade is broad-etched with biblical scenes, and the pommel contains allegedly a splinter of the true cross. Æthelstan accepts it with solemn grace and then sets it carefully behind a curtain. Later you hear him mutter, "One day someone will kill a man with that cross." Meanwhile, students and scholars begin appearing in court. Æthelstan creates space for scribes and monks from all over Europe. A few teach, most observe. One bold Italian tries to teach Latin metrics to the king himself and gets as far as hexameter before Æthelstan waves him off with a smile. Historians still argue whether Æthelstan's court was truly a European center of learning or just a temporary trend. Some call it the first renaissance of English royal culture. Others say it was just a shiny distraction pageantry with good grammar. Whatever the truth, the guests kept coming. More quietly, you notice something else. Diplomatic documents begin flowing outward. Letters written in Æthelstan's name, praises rulers abroad, offering gifts, sometimes even quoting scripture. They're not just flattery, they're a claim. A way of saying, look how cultured I am. Look how many kings I know. And by the way, remember who unified this rainy island. Fringe anecdote one charter from Burgundy accidentally titles Æthelstan Emperor of the Saxons and Sheep. A scribe's error. Possibly, possibly not. And then comes a moment you weren't expecting. A boy arrives at court. Tall, thin, with a hesitant smile and hair the color of walnut. He's introduced as Alan of Brittany, a prince whose father has been overthrown. Æthelstan offers him shelter, not as a hostage, not as a refugee, as family. This isn't unusual for Æthelstan. He collects displaced royals like others collect relics. Sons of deposed kings, nephews of exiled dukes all find a place here in a court that smells like ink and ambition. Æthelstan becomes their godfather, their patron, their quiet teacher. One of them, Louis, yes, another Louis will go on to be king of the West Franks, and he'll do it with Æthelstan's help. Because Æthelstan doesn't just forge alliances, he builds kings. You start to see it now. The court is no longer just English. It's continental. It's multilingual. It's layered with courtiers who've eaten snails in Burgundy and knelt at Saxon altars. The English nobles blink and shuffle, slightly uncomfortable with the cosmopolitan flair, but no one dares complain too loudly. The king is in command, and he's watching every reaction. Late at night, you sit beside him in the library chamber, watching his fingers trace the spine of a manuscript sent from Aachen. You ask if he trusts all these foreign lords, all these honeyed smiles and embroidered bribes. He doesn't look up. I don't need to trust them, he says. I only need them to remember me. There's a sound you've grown used to in Æthelstan's court, the papery hiss of parchment being unrolled, followed by the dry click of a bishop's tongue. Today, that sound signals the beginning of another royal council, though this one feels different. The king is not content merely to govern through letters and marriages. He's ready to legislate. The chamber is crowded nobles, with polished boots, abbots with rings too large for their fingers, and a few anxious-looking reeves with ink-stained cuffs. Æthelstan steps forward in his usual quiet way, carrying not a sword, but a scroll. It's thick, sealed in red wax, and heavy with implications. This is the first of his major law codes, and you're about to witness how order is built, not with battles, but with carefully chosen words. He begins by reading aloud calmly, almost gently. The room quiets as his voice spreads. No shouting, no grandstanding, just steady decrees laws on theft weights and measures oath-breaking sanctuary rights. And somewhere between clause 15 and 16, a new rule on hair length. Yes, hair. Apparently some noblemen have begun adopting hairstyles considered suspiciously Danish. Æthelstan decrees that Englishmen must wear their hair short and their beards neat. Identity, it seems, is now a matter of grooming. Fringe fact, a disgruntled noble in the north supposedly protested by growing out his mustache to hide his contempt. His lands were confiscated shortly after, perhaps, coincidentally. Other laws are sterner. One section addresses coin forgery, declaring that anyone caught clipping silver shall lose not just their property, but in some cases their life. Æthelstan is making it clear the king's face on a coin is not to be tampered with. And then there's the crime of harboring a thief. Entire households can be fined, towns fined, even monasteries. Æthelstan has no interest in polite ambiguity. The law is to be obeyed or the consequences will come knocking. You'd think this would make him unpopular. But the opposite happens. Word spreads that this king, this stone-faced scribe in a cloak, is fair. Harsh, yes, but fair. The poor know that under Æthelstan the same laws apply to a thegn and a miller. That a man can appeal to the king's law and actually be heard. You watch a farmer travel 3 days to lay a complaint about a corrupt reeve. He's not thrown out, he's listened to, and that listening it echoes outward. Æthelstan's law councils are held not just in Wessex, but in places like Exeter, Tamworth, and York. He goes to the people, or at least their representatives. He invites local lords, reeves, even priests to speak. Sometimes they say too much. Once in York, a priest complains about the burdens of tithing. Æthelstan smiles, nods, and then quotes a passage of scripture back at him in Latin with poetic emphasis. The priest turns an alarming shade of pink. You also notice the laws get more philosophical as time passes. One code includes instructions on moral behavior. Fathers must raise their sons with honor. Masters must treat slaves with a shred of dignity. No one is to eat meat during Lent unless they're near death. And absolutely no one under any circumstances is to steal livestock during a funeral. Yes, that last one is real. Historians still debate what incident inspired it. Theories range from drunken mourners to revenge pranks involving sheep. And then comes the oath laws. Every free man is now required to swear allegiance not to their local lord, but to Æthelstan himself. It's a revolutionary move. The loyalty pyramid is being flattened. The king is making sure that whether you're a lord or a blacksmith, your oath goes straight to the top. Fringe anecdote: in one town, a group of men reportedly misunderstood the law and swore their oath to the stone wall of Æthelstan's chapel. When corrected, they did it again, this time facing the actual king, who was deeply amused. You wonder if Æthelstan fears rebellion. But from what you've seen, he fears ambiguity more. His laws are sharp, sometimes painfully detailed, and always framed in a tone that suggests you should have known this already. Late one night, you watch him in his chamber. The fire is low and he's reading a tablet of wax covered in smudged notes. You ask if he enjoys making laws. I don't, he says flatly. But laws keep men from being ruled by accident. He taps the wax with his stylus. If I die tomorrow, this stays, if they doubt they can read. You realize that for Æthelstan, law is legacy. A sword rusts, a son may disappoint, but a charter sealed and copied lives beyond the bones. Still, not everyone is impressed. Some nobles grumble that the laws are too specific, that they reach into corners where kings shouldn't tread, into hearths, into stables, into bedrooms. One baron mutters that he can't even flog a servant without counting witnesses now. He's not wrong. Historians still argue whether Æthelstan's codes were really enforced outside the royal gaze. Enforcement in the Danelaw regions, for instance, was likely spotty, but that misses the point. The existence of the law changes behavior. People believe the king sees them. That's power, that's design. And so Æthelstan writes on. You watch his scribes draft copies for every major minster and town hall. Some of the copies have gilded initials. Some are scratched into rough vellum. But all carry the same message: the king has eyes, the king has rules, and you are part of something bigger now. Not just a village, not just a shire. A nation held together by ink wax and a firm understanding that you should never ever steal sheep from a funeral. The chapel smells of old stone beeswax and a hint of damp wool. You're standing in the shadows watching Æthelstan kneel before a small reliquary, silver gilt shaped, like a house containing what's claimed to be a piece of Saint Cuthbert's belt. Or a thread of it. Or maybe just a thread that was near it once. It doesn't matter. Æthelstan treats it with reverence either way. For this king, faith isn't performance, it's politics. But that doesn't mean it's empty. He believes in his own way. He believes in relics and the power of saints and the soft authority of incense and robes. But he also believes in what faith can do. You start to notice the church rising in his plans not just as a spiritual partner, but as a structural ally. Monasteries are being endowed. Bishoprics are expanding. And Æthelstan. He's there behind it all, handing over land and relics like a man building a kingdom with both stone and soul. One day you ride with him to Malmesbury Abbey. The road is long, the weather bitter, but Æthelstan insists on going. He walks, not rides, the last half-mile, boots muddied, cloak soaked. He enters the abbey in silence, prays before a stone tomb, and places a gold brooch on the altar. Whose grave, you whisper? Saint Aldhelm, someone murmurs. A poet king like him. Later, Æthelstan tells the abbot to expect new books, and coins, and an extra parcel of land for the scriptorium. You realize this isn't just generosity, it's investment. He's buying memory, and yet the relationship with the church isn't all incense and harmony. Æthelstan is too clever, too cautious to let bishops grow too bold. He keeps a close circle of clergy, some say suspiciously close. Take Wulfhelm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. A pious man, sure, but he's also politically agile. You notice how often he appears beside Æthelstan in charters, how his tone shifts when the king enters a room. Theirs is a careful dance of mutual need. Fringe detail. One story claims Æthelstan once disguised himself as a pilgrim to test Wulfhelm's hospitality. He reportedly knocked on the archbishop's door in rags, and Wulfhelm gave him a coin and a warm meal. Æthelstan revealed himself the next day, laughed, and granted the bishop a manor. No one knows if this actually happened, but it shows up in 3 different manuscripts each, with slightly more dramatic retellings. You notice something else: the king begins importing saints. Not actual saints, of course, but their relics, bones, cloth shards of supposed crosses. Æthelstan brings them in from the continent, often paying steep prices or making pointed requests from abbots abroad. Why? Because relics bring prestige. Monasteries with relics attract pilgrims. Pilgrims bring coin devotion and storytelling. A saint's femur becomes a beacon, and Æthelstan, ever the strategist, is planting them all over his realm. He doesn't stop at importing. He redistributes too. One famous case sees him send a piece of St. Samson's rib to a church in Exeter after the town suffers a flood. The message is clear: you are not forgotten. The king sees you, the saints see you too. Historians still argue whether Æthelstan's use of relics was sincere or cynical. Some say he was a devout reformer. Others say he used the church like a well-dressed public relations department. A few charmingly insist he was merely a collector with an unusual taste in souvenirs. But it's not all iconography and incense. Æthelstan's support extends to education. He funds scriptoria rooms where monks copy texts by hand line, by aching line. Latin psalters, law codes, old epics. You walk past one room where a monk has sketched a tiny rabbit in the margin of Leviticus, a moment of levity in an otherwise brutal passage. Fringe fact: one scriptorium in Æthelstan's reign is said to have invented a new ink recipe involving crushed hazelnuts. The formula was so bitter it repelled mice. The pages survived. The monk's teeth did not. You realize Æthelstan isn't just preserving the church, he's using it as a network. Monks talk, bishops travel, word spreads through sermons and psalms, through shared texts and swap stories. And wherever they go, they take Æthelstan's name with them. He even inserts himself into church politics abroad. When disputes break out in Frankish or Burgundian monasteries, Æthelstan writes letters, offers support, sometimes even sends envoys. It's not about control, it's about connection. And connection for Æthelstan is currency. In York, you overhear him speaking with a northern bishop about the status of Irish monasteries. He knows which abbots have feuded, which relics have been disputed, even which bells have gone missing. You wonder when he had time to learn all this. The bishop says you know more of our shrines than we do. Æthelstan only smiles. That's the job. Even the papacy takes notice. There are hints, faint ones, that Pope John X, or maybe John VI, records are hazy, sends a letter praising Æthelstan's defense of the faithful. One report says a papal ring was sent to him as a gift. Another says he sent a relic of St. Peter's beard in return. Again, hard to confirm, but somehow you're not surprised. Æthelstan is building legitimacy not just in England but across Christendom. A king of relics, a king of letters, a king who prays but also plans. At night you find him again in the chapel, thumbing through a psalter, murmuring verses. A candle flickers beside him. You ask quietly if he fears for his soul. He shrugs, not flippant but firm. I fear forgetting what a soul is. Outside, the rain taps against the stone. The bells begin to toll. And Æthelstan, he keeps reading. The road west is rougher than you expect, rutted, rain-washed with rocks that make horses snort and wheel nervously. But Æthelstan is undeterred. He rides at the front of the column wrapped in a thick wool cloak, his brow furrowed against the Cornish wind. You're heading into a land that frankly doesn't think it's part of England. Cornwall has always been a bit prickly. To the Cornish, this land is Cernow, a rugged, sea-bitten finger of hills and moors that has resisted every invader from Rome to Wessex. The people speak a different tongue. Their saints have different names, and their churches feel older, rougher, but somehow purer. You smell peat fires and salt air, hear bells that don't ring on southern schedules. Officially, Cornwall is part of Æthelstan's realm. Unofficially, it's more of a sideways nod than a salute. That changes today. Æthelstan doesn't come in with swords drawn. Instead, he arrives like a guest, an uninvited one, sure but polite. He visits local abbeys first, offers gifts, talks about saints, listens to local elders who grumble about land boundaries and taxes they haven't paid in years. And then very quietly he annexes Exeter. That's the turning point. Exeter had been straddling the line between Saxon and Cornish identity. Its churches were bilingual, its bishops politically slippery. Æthelstan walks in, fortifies the city, kicks out the remaining Brittonic clergy, and declares it English. It's a move both symbolic and practical. Exeter becomes a line in the sand. West of it, Cornwall. East of it, England. Clear, firm, royal. Historians still argue whether this was an act of aggression or integration. Some call it wise. Others call it brutal cultural erasure. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the muddy footprints between the two. Fringe detail, one Exeter Chronicle claims. Æthelstan built a wall to keep the Cornish out, but forgets to mention the wall was only knee-high and mainly served to redirect sheep. Still, it made for a good story. You travel deeper into Cornwall and you can feel the resistance softening but not disappearing. The Cornish rulers agree to tribute payments. They attend a royal feast in Devonshire reluctantly. One even kisses Æthelstan's ring. But the language barrier remains. So does the deep-rooted pride. Æthelstan never pushes further. He doesn't outlaw the Cornish tongue, doesn't burn churches. He understands something crucial. Sometimes dominance looks better from a distance. So he lets them keep their shrines, their saints, their ceremonies, so long as they remember who holds the tax rolls. And then there's the tale of the sword. One afternoon, a Cornish lord, gray-bearded, half-drunk, very proud, approaches Æthelstan with a gift, a curved blade said to be from an old British king. He offers it not as tribute, but as a challenge. Æthelstan doesn't flinch. He accepts the blade, thanks the man, then without a word draws his own sword and places both on the altar of the nearest church. Let God decide which serves better, he says. The Cornishman leaves speechless. No blood drawn, but the message is clear. Fringe anecdote, the same sword or so. Legend claims later hangs in Tavistock Abbey for 200 years, until it vanishes during a renovation. Some say it was smuggled back to Cornwall. Others say it ended up in the Thames, used as ballast on a monk's boat. Back at court, you hear nobles murmuring about the Cornish submission. Some want tighter control tax inspectors, land confiscations, stricter law enforcement. Æthelstan shakes his head. They know who rules, he says. Let them call it peace. But he doesn't stop with Cornwall. He starts reaching outward to Wales too. The Welsh kings. Hywel Dda among them send letters, attend councils, offer token gifts. They're not conquered, not exactly, but they appear at Æthelstan's court when summoned. They join him at diplomatic events. They agree to fixed borders, many of which still exist today. One particularly memorable council sees 5 Welsh kings lined up beside Æthelstan. None smile, one scowls, but all sign the charter. Æthelstan doesn't gloat. He simply nods, folds the document, and hands each of them a set of matching robes. Fringe fact. A 12th century poem claims these robes are all slightly too short in the sleeves, an intentional insult. More likely, they were just badly measured. You begin to realize that Æthelstan's conquest of the Southwest is not about obliteration. It's about inclusion through ritual. He doesn't rewrite the map. He draws it darker. Every charter, every council, every carefully staged royal feast pulls these edges of Britain into something firmer, something more unified. At night, you ride through the Devon hills with a small royal escort. The stars are bright. The air smells of pine and ash. Æthelstan rides ahead, quiet, his cloak flapping in the wind like a banner with no emblem. You ask him why he doesn't conquer Cornwall outright, why not build forts, install sheriffs, end the resistance completely. He turns in the saddle. Because I'd rather they pretend to love me, he says, than die cursing my name. Then he spurs his horse onward. Behind you in the moonlight, the distant towers of Exeter gleam like a line drawn across the world. The edges of your map begin to curl northward. The Cornish have quieted the Welsh kings attend court in increasingly well-tailored robes, and now Æthelstan turns his eyes toward the territories beyond Hadrian's Wall. Scotland, or at least the sprawling patchwork of kingdoms, lords, and chieftains that will one day wear that name properly. You travel with him past the old Roman roads, watching the terrain grow rockier, wilder, as the sheep outnumber the people and the air picks up that brisk northern sharpness. This land doesn't just feel foreign, it feels ancient, stubborn, uncertain. To the north lies the kingdom of Alba, ruled by Constantine the Sacred. a king with lineage as long as a saint's arm bone, and a wariness sharper than any broadsword. He's clever, he's cautious, and he doesn't answer letters quickly. Æthelstan doesn't wait. He summons Constantine to court. Yes, summons a bold move. The kind of command that might start a war or win a kingdom. You're there at the edge of Tamworth when Constantine arrives. His cloak is dark as night, his beard streaked with frost, his eyes scanning the court like a man searching for traps behind every pillar. He kneels. Not for long, but he does it. This moment echoes through the walls, through the years, through the very idea of English kingship. A Scottish king bows even briefly to Æthelstan. It's not submission, not officially, but it's close enough that scribes will whisper it into charters for decades to come. Historians still argue about this moment. Did Constantine kneel as a sign of homage, or was it more of a diplomatic courtesy? Did he swear loyalty? Or did he simply nod to avoid a scene? The records are maddeningly vague, which frankly feels like Constantine's style. Fringe detail, one Welsh observer wrote that Constantine's cloak had more silver thread than honest intention. Another swore he smelled like pine and foreign wine. But Constantine is only the beginning. One by one, Æthelstan invites or requires the kings and lords of Strathclyde, Cumbria, and Man to meet him. Some come willingly. Some need prompting. A few need bribes disguised as gifts. But they all come. They all sit at the same long table. And they all acknowledge Æthelstan as the king. He begins signing letters not as King of the English, but as King of the English and the Britons. It's a subtle change, subtle like a pebble tossed in a still lake. The ripples are immediate. You see it in the faces of his council, in the stiff postures of the northern guests, in the way the coins from this era start to bear more Latin, more emphasis on divine right, more by God's grace, and defender of all Britain inscriptions. Æthelstan's kingdom now stretches, if not fully in control, then certainly in influence from the Channel to the Clyde. But influence is not peace. Tensions simmer. Constantine returns north, polite but bristling. The Welsh princes murmur among themselves. The Norse Gaels never quiet for long start making visits to Irish courts and whispering about alliances. And then there's Olaf Guthfrithson, Norse Gael king of Dublin, whose father, Æthelstan, had once displaced from York. He's young, charismatic, and carries an axe with a wolf carved into the haft. You hear his name again and again in court conversations, first as a rumor, then as a threat. Æthelstan isn't surprised. He starts building again, not castles, but alliances. He strengthens ties with European rulers, sends more sisters to more marriages, sends gifts, books, relics, sends messages to Normandy, to Saxony, to Burgundy, always polite, always exacting. It's diplomacy as architecture, careful load-bearing meant to last. And at home, he keeps the borders fluid but firm. He issues new charters reasserting land claims in the north, reorganizes bishoprics, posts reeves where there had only been chieftains, draws lines where once there were only hills. Fringe anecdote, a letter survives in which Æthelstan politely asks a northern noble not to use the title kinglet when referring to himself. The noble replies with a poem that both flatters and mocks the king. The response, Æthelstan sends him a silver goblet and a list of acceptable titles. You begin to realize how much of Æthelstan's strength lies not in overwhelming force, but in the imposition of pattern. Where there is chaos, he lays grids. Where there are customs, he builds courts. Where there is ambiguity, he fills it with ink and witness signatures. And the church helps. The northern monasteries receive gifts, some of them extravagant. One gets a gold chalice. Another receives books bound in silver. A third, for reasons never explained, receives a robe made from imported goose down. The abbot weeps upon receipt. It's soft power, but it lands hard. Even Iona, far off and once rebellious, sends polite letters in this era. Æthelstan doesn't visit. He doesn't need to. Still, you sense the tension rising like distant thunder. The Welsh kings bristle. Constantine paces. Olaf sharpens. Æthelstan tightens. You're standing with him one morning as he watches riders practice drills in a fog-laced field. He holds his sword not to swing it, just to feel its weight. You ask if he expects a war. No, he says, then adds, but I expect a reminder. You don't ask what he means. You don't have to, because the maps are changing again. Borders are drying into ink. Loyalties are crystallizing. And somewhere on a ship in Dublin or in a chamber in Alba, someone is planning something sharp. But for now, here in the mist, the king of the English and the Briton stands tall. And for once, no one questions it. The fog doesn't lift for days. You're camped somewhere between the Trent and the Humber, where the trees thin into scrub and every hill looks vaguely like an ambush. Æthelstan isn't speaking much. Not out of fear, out of calculation. His brow is furrowed, not from worry, but from weighing a dozen possibilities and trying to choose the least bloody. Because now it's not whispers or border letters, it's movement. Real military movement. Olaf Guthfrithson is back. Not just back, but bold. The young Norse-Gael king has crossed from Dublin to reclaim York, and this time he's not alone. Word spreads like wildfire across the Boers. Constantine of Alba has joined him. So has Owain of Strathclyde. The uneasy alliances Æthelstan once held together with oaths and ceremony are unraveling like poorly tied bootlaces. The North has risen. This is no border raid, this is a coalition. And now for the first time in a long while, Æthelstan is preparing for open war. You walk with him through the mustering grounds near Tamworth. The field is a churn of hooves, iron leather, and shouting. You count banners from Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia. Even a few Welsh flags, Hywel Dda, the clever one, has stayed loyal, or at least smart. Æthelstan doesn't roar orders. He walks quietly among the men, pausing at the forge tents, checking arrow stores, nodding at commanders. He touches a boy's shoulder and reminds him to sleep well. He lifts a helmet from the ground and turns it slowly in his hand before handing it back without a word. The battle isn't here yet, but it's coming. And Æthelstan is ready. Historians still marvel at what happens next, not because the tactics are especially revolutionary, but because everything works. The logistics impeccable. Grain carts stagger northward in perfect intervals. Supply lines stay unbroken. Troop cohesion remarkably tight for an army pulled together from such disparate corners. Fringe fact 1, particularly imaginative scribe claimed Æthelstan organized his men by psalm numbers, assigning formations based on verses. For example, those who march under Psalm 23 would advance first, etc. It's very likely untrue, but it's too delightful not to imagine. But the most impressive part is the pace. Æthelstan moves fast. Before Olaf's alliance can entrench themselves in York, the king is on the road pushing his men harder than they've ever marched. You pass through Nottingham, past Doncaster, through fields, still dew slick with morning chill. The army sleeps in shifts, eats little, complains less. You hear a soldier mutter. The king moves like he's already seen the ending. And then you reach the battlefield, Brunanburh. Where exactly it is remains one of history's favorite games. Scholars still squabble over maps, over stray mentions in chronicles, over hill contours and river curves. But you are here now, standing in a low valley shrouded in mist, surrounded by the smell of trampled grass and damp leather. The coalition is set up opposite. You see Olaf's men's sleek armor, raven banners, eyes glittering like storm clouds. Constantine's soldiers steadier, heavier, wrapped in tartan and silence. Owain's warriors lean and fierce, already singing under their breath. Æthelstan watches them from a ridge. He doesn't blink. You expect a grand speech, a cry of destiny. Instead, he says to his closest commander, "We finish this. We finish it so thoroughly they won't forget for 100 years." And then, with no more ceremony than a breakfast bell, the lines move. Fringe anecdote, some say Æthelstan carried a relic into battle St. Cuthbert's banner, or a fragment of the True Cross. Others claim he simply wore the same belt Alfred once gave him. Either way, no king's regalia ever mattered more in that moment. The tactics unfold like clockwork. Æthelstan doesn't lead a blind charge. He uses layered formations, drawing Olaf's faster warriors into narrow paths, then slamming into them from the flanks. The Mercians hold the center. The East Anglians hammer the left. Welsh archers strike from the rise. At one point, the Norse nearly break the line, but Æthelstan, calm amid the roar, redirects a reserve force exactly where the breach forms. It holds. The battle rages all day. Blood, mud, and prayer mix in the air. You can't hear commands anymore, just cries, screams, the clash of blades, the dull thud of axe to shield. By nightfall, 5 kings lie dead. That's not poetic exaggeration, it's the historical record. 5 kings Olaf's allies, possibly even his kin, slaughtered or driven to drown in retreat. Olaf, he flees. Some say to his ship. Some say through a river marsh. He vanishes into history's fog. Constantine survives, but barely. His son dies on the field. He returns to Alba with blood on his cloak and no illusions about who wears the crown now. You walk among the bodies. It's quiet. Not peace, just exhaustion. You see Æthelstan standing near a fallen banner, his sword dragging slightly in the soil. He doesn't smile. He doesn't weep. He just stares, as if the earth has finally accepted the lines he drew on it. Historians still call Brunanburh the birthplace of England, the moment when the idea of one kingdom became reality, not by ceremony, but by cost. And Æthelstan, he says little. That night, a scribe offers to begin composing a poem. Æthelstan listens, then suggests a single line to start it. You don't hear what it is. But the poem that survives the Battle of Brunanburh becomes legend. You sleep beside the king's tent, wrapped in a wool cloak that still smells faintly of ash. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cries. You wonder if it's Olaf's still waiting for a master who won't return. And as the stars turn overhead, you realize there is no king now, but Æthelstan. New rival, no question, just silence, and the beginning of something permanent. Dawn is slow the morning after Brunanburh. The light spills over the field in long, hesitant strokes, painting the damp earth in pewter and copper. The dead are still being counted. The camp is quiet, not the stillness of peace, but the hush of aftershock. You walk past men cleaning weapons, not from rust, but from memory. Æthelstan is already up, not resting, not celebrating, reading. He's seated beneath a makeshift canopy hair, damp from a wash basin, a fresh tunic over armor still streaked with dried blood. In his hands, a psalter, of course. That same one. His fingers trace the Latin lines as though the words are an anchor. You expect a sigh, a muttered prayer, perhaps even a rare confession of fatigue. Instead, he turns to you and says, "Did you know Aldhelm once wrote about the foolishness of those who learn but never teach?" You blink. The air still smells like sweat and iron. He's quoting church fathers after one of the most brutal victories in Anglo-Saxon history. Because that's Æthelstan. He doesn't pause to bask in glory. He pivots. From war, back to learning. Back to shaping not just land and law but minds. You notice the shift immediately. Court is different after Brunanburh. It's not just the titles that have changed, though. Now they call him Rex Anglorum, et totius Britannia. King of the English and all Britain, it's the tone. There's an urgency to his cultural efforts now. He begins to treat his court as a schoolroom. Monks arrive from abroad with scrolls under their arms. Scribes begin copying not just laws, but poetry. Bibles, of course, but also histories. Æthelstan is obsessed with record keeping. He wants everything written down. Names, dates, genealogies, deeds, mistakes, especially mistakes. Fringe fact: one surviving charter includes a footnote in Æthelstan's own hand correcting the spelling of a noble's name. Beneath it, he wrote, "Names like crowns must be exact." He starts inviting scholars from abroad. You meet an Irish monk with a braided belt and a habit of quoting Virgil when asked the time. Another comes from Pavia and gifts Æthelstan a peculiar treatise on astrology. The king reads it, thanks him politely, and promptly has it shelved under harmless nonsense. But it's not just monks and manuscripts. Children arrive. Not his own Æthelstan never marries, but wards. Sons of allied kings, sons of conquered ones, sons of those who might one day need a nudge. Alan of Brittany returns older now. A few Frankish boys with complex family trees trail behind him. One quiet lad named Louis comes from France, a future king, raised among Anglo-Saxon clerks and whispering firewood. Æthelstan educates them himself sometimes, not always directly. But you see him ask questions over meals, press maps into small hands, toss coins and ask what's wrong with the minting here. You watch him test the boys not with cruelty, but with care. Historians still debate what to call this part of his reign. Some name it a royal academy. Others call it a political nursery. A few dismiss it as flattery disguised as parenting. But you see something more strategic. Æthelstan is building loyalty before crowns even fit. He also makes time for art. Commissions new gospel covers. Orders psalters to be gilded. Approves tapestries that don't just depict saints but kings. Kings who look suspiciously like him. One odd detail: a poem appears during this period that compares Æthelstan to Solomon. It's full of flattering nonsense, his wisdom greater than rivers, and his voice like balm upon the wind. But Æthelstan doesn't ban it. He doesn't encourage it either. He simply nods, then asks the poet to write something about justice instead. Fringe anecdote: Æthelstan once attended a debate between two monks over whether animals have souls. The debate lasted 3 hours. At the end, he declared, "My horse knows me better than some men with souls." The room went very quiet. He also standardizes learning for clergy, orders new primers for church schools, expands monastic libraries, funds training for scribes not just to write, but to write legibly. A confused word is no word at all, he tells a young copyist, whose letters look like ants in a thunderstorm. And then there's the crown jewel, the Gloucester Psalter, a massive volume thick with gold illumination filled with marginalia and art. It's said that Æthelstan personally chose some of the illustrations. One monk swears the king requested a picture of King David not looking like he's in pain. That Psalter survives. You stare at it one day, tracing the shimmer of paint across the page. And you realize this isn't just for devotion. It's propaganda, but propaganda dressed as prayer. Because for Æthelstan, learning isn't decoration. It's authority. It's how you hold a realm together when the sword is sheathed. It's how you outlast your enemies. At night, the court is quieter now. The bards still play, but the conversations hum with scripture and history. Latin phrases drift over roast meats. The rustle of turning parchment has become a lullaby. You sit beside the king one evening as he corrects a charter. You ask him if he misses war. He doesn't answer right away. Then, war teaches quickly. Books teach better. Outside, the stars shimmer over a kingdom where, for the first time in memory, the borders are stable. The churches are full. And the king is building a legacy not just in silver and soil, but in thought. And still somewhere beyond the sea, you suspect new troubles will come. But tonight the lamps glow gold, the ink dries clean, and the king writes on. The boots come out again. Not the soft court slippers embroidered with saints and vines, the real boots. Thick-soled, mud-streaked, stitched leather scuffed from old campaigns. Æthelstan pulls them on one morning without saying much. You've learned what that means. It's time to move. Because even with all the charters, the coins, the oaths, and the beautifully illuminated Psalter's kingship still has teeth. And north of the peaceful learning halls, those teeth are being bared again. Whispers drift south. Olaf Guthfrithson has returned. Yes, again. The Norse Gale King has landed once more in Northumbria, breathing fire and memory. The defeat at Brunanburh wasn't enough. He wants York back, or revenge, or both. And this time he's not alone. Constantine II of Alba, wounded pride and all, has joined him again. You have to admire their persistence. Æthelstan does not call another great council. He doesn't write polite letters. He doesn't even wait for full confirmation. He moves. You ride north again. The lands you passed just months ago, the bridges, the crossroads, the quiet abbeys blur by once more, this time under tighter guard and a weightier silence. This doesn't feel like Brunanburh. There's something darker here. Less glorious, more necessary. But then something unexpected happens. As Æthelstan approaches York ready for war, ready for another stand, the enemy vanishes. Literally vanishes. Olaf flees back across the sea. Constantine retreats into the hills. The alliance collapses before a sword is drawn. Why? No one's sure. Perhaps it was the memory of Brunanburh. Perhaps it was internal fighting. Or maybe it was just the weight of Æthelstan's name. Whatever the cause, the threat disintegrates and the North falls silent. Historians still debate whether this was a planned maneuver, psychological warfare, or just a stroke of luck. Some say Æthelstan's spies had done their work. Others say his enemies lost heart when their allies blinked. But what's clear is this: there's no battle, just a retaking. Æthelstan enters York without bloodshed. No resistance, just quiet submission. He holds court there for weeks, hosts councils, issues decrees, visits churches, talks to local elders, and this part stuns you: he speaks Norse. Not fluently, but enough. Enough to make the merchants listen. Enough to show that his claim over this land isn't just military, it's cultural. Fringe fact, one account says he even gave a short speech in Old Norse, using phrases borrowed from traders in the Dublin courts. One sentence supposedly translated to "this land stands with both feet." A bit clunky, but memorable. And yet while the cities welcome him, the borders twitch. Æthelstan doesn't trust the calm. He starts shoring up defenses. He orders new forts, not massive castles, but smaller, sharper fortifications along river crossings and high passes. He has roads repaired, way stations built, grain stockpiled. You see it all happening quietly under the pretense of infrastructure. But it's preparation, always preparation. Then he does something subtle and brilliant. He begins reorganizing the ranks. You watch nobles shift uncomfortably as they're reassigned. One proud lord from Wessex suddenly finds himself posted to a chilly fort near the Scottish border. Another gets a promotion that somehow leaves him farther from court. Æthelstan doesn't punish openly, he redistributes. He also mixes cultural lines. He appoints Anglo-Scandinavians to positions of trust, gives land to former Norse loyalists, marries their local customs with royal expectations, offers places in his court to men who once wore raven brooches. Fringe anecdote: one minor noble from York reportedly changed his name from Raffen to Regenwald after receiving land from Æthelstan. His grandson would later write that the old name was too sharp for soft benches. Æthelstan visits monasteries again, but this time he focuses on the northern ones: Jarrow, Whitby, Hexham. He endows them not just with coin, but with books, relics, priests from the south. The influence grows like ivy. He stays longer in the north than expected. He walks the coastlines, rests at small churches. Once he sits with the fisherman's family and eats salted cod on rough bread. No ceremony, just presence. And presence for Æthelstan is a strategy. You see it in how he holds audiences listening longer than usual, how he speaks of unity, not victory, how he frames the realm now, not as a kingdom of conquered lands, but as a single house with many rooms. One scribe begins calling him not conqueror, but keeper. You ask him one night near Ripon if he's planning another campaign. No, he says. Then after a pause, I'm building silence. You don't understand at first, then you do. He's not fighting enemies anymore. He's outlasting them. He's planting laws, loyalties, libraries, things that can't be overthrown with an axe swing. Historians still marvel at how little open conflict followed this second northern push. How, for the first time in generations, the North stayed quiet. Some credit Æthelstan's diplomacy. Others credit exhaustion. A few credit the weather. But you've been here. You know better. It's the roads, the schools, the coinage, the mixed language councils, the calm visits to harsh places. It's the feeling that this king will always be watching, even when he's gone. One day you pass through a village near the Pennines and hear a child call, Æthelstan, the quiet king who hears everything. You ask who taught him that. He shrugs. Everyone knows it. And that's when you realize the war is over. The campaign is won. And not a sword had to fall. You wake to the hush that follows anticipation. That peculiar stillness when everything is in place. Troops arranged messages, sent prayers muttered, and all that remains is for the sky to change. The banners are stowed, the horns are silent. There's no announcement, but you know something monumental is coming. Because today's Brunanburh, again, except this time, not the clash of shields and bone. This time, it's the memory of Brunanburh, its echo turned into verse, into legend, and you're about to hear it take shape. The court is gathered in a timber hall lit by firelight and long golden dusk. The king is present but seated off to the side, not at the head of the table but almost among the scribes. He's unadorned today and plain wool fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Watching. At the center stands a bard, or at least someone close enough, a court poet, possibly a monk with a flair for drama. He lifts his eyes, clears his throat, and begins to recite, Here came the Anlaf, and also Constantine, the hoary-haired Northman, and the gray king of Alba, with fleet and fury and many a shield. It begins not as flattery, but as testament. And suddenly the room fades away. You're not in a hall anymore. You're back on that misty battlefield. Spears bristle like winter wheat. Boots churn the mud. The bards speak in rhythm and alliteration, each syllable hammering into place like the forging of a crown. Æthelstan doesn't react outwardly, but his fingers twitch once subtly as the lines recount. King Æthelstan, ringgiver, war-strong, lord of blade hosts, breaker of shield walls. The crowd listens in rapt silence. Even the youngest squires, even the bored courtiers. Because this isn't just performance. This is history being frozen in poetry. You watch a scribe nearby copy it down word for word. Not because someone asked, but because they must. The Battle of Brunanburh poem will be copied into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It will become the first real piece of English nationalist literature. Not nationalist in the modern sense, but in the foundational sense. It will say, we were here. This happened. This is who we are. Fringe fact later copies of the poem will include marginal doodles, helmets, horses, and once a very confused-looking bird. Some speculate these were drawn by bored novices. Others suggest they were part of a monastic annotation game. Either way, the verses endure. The bard continues. 5 kings lay on the battlefield, shorn of shields doomed by swordplay, and 7 war-earls too broken by fate. You can feel the weight in the words. Not just the glory, But the cost. Æthelstan has never glorified war. He's used it, yes, masterfully, but always with that steady, calculating gaze like a carpenter who knows every nail weakens the board a little more. After the poem ends, there's no applause, no cheering, just the sound of firewood cracking. And then slowly, Æthelstan rises. He nods to the poet, says nothing, walks away. Because it's done. The story is locked. And once it's told, a king doesn't need to repeat himself. Later in the quiet of your chamber, you see copies being made. Multiple. Æthelstan wants this poem everywhere. In monasteries, in schools, in halls. Not because he's proud, but because he's planning again. This poem isn't just memory. It's a message. To future kings, to future enemies. Know that we stood. Know that we won. Know that England is not a thing to be lightly challenged. Historians still debate who wrote it. Some say a monk from Winchester. Some say Æthelstan himself had a hand in it. Others claim it evolved over time, verses added, smoothed, reshaped like a sword handle worn by generations of grip. There are two curious lines added in one later version that aren't in the original. They describe Æthelstan turning away from conquest to cloisters, hinting at his later years. Possibly wishful thinking, possibly prophetic. Either way, the lines linger. He set down his helm but raised up a lamp. A strange phrase, but fitting. You notice, too, that no other kings are named quite as often after this. No Alfred. No Edward. Æthelstan becomes the benchmark, the point of comparison. Even his enemies start copying his style, issuing coins with firmer images, writing laws with greater clarity, gathering poets to tell their side of Brunanburh. But the ink came first here, and the ink has Æthelstan's seal. Fringe anecdote one 13th century chronicler tried to claim the poem was actually about a different battle. His manuscript was quietly ignored for 400 years until rediscovered in a library where someone had scribbled "Wrong King, Good Rhythm" in the margins. As for Æthelstan, you begin to see him soften slightly, not in mind but in posture. The battle is won. The borders are sealed. The story has been told. He spends more time in prayer now, more time in consultation with his scribes. Less writing, more rewriting. You find him one morning editing an old charter, not because it's wrong, but because the phrasing could be more elegant. It's not enough to rule, he says. You have to read as a ruler, too. One evening, a young scribe asks him what part of Brunanburh he remembers most. Æthelstan thinks, then says the silence before the charge, a long pause. Then, and the look in Olaf's eyes, like he already knew how it would end. You realize Æthelstan didn't just win the battle, he rewrote how kings would win forever after. Not just by blade, but by verse. The rain is softer these days. Not gone, never gone in this part of the world, but more of a mist, more of a gentle whisper than a declaration. It clings to your cloak, dapples the parchments in the scriptorium, and settles like memory on the stone arches of churches, newly fortified under Æthelstan's patronage. Peace has its own sound. And Æthelstan, he walks more slowly now. He's not old, not yet. But the weight of rule has settled into his spine, his shoulders, the slight tightness in his knees, when he kneels in prayer longer than usual. You see it in the way he leans forward during council hands, steepled gaze fixed. The pace has changed. So has his kingdom. For the first time, there are no known rivals. No Viking kings in York. No rebellious Mercian warlords. Constantine of Alba stays behind his rivers. Olaf Guthfrithson has vanished again, some say Dublin, some say the grave. And the realm, quiet. Not soft, but firm. Like a house finally fully built. The law holds. The roads remain clear. Even the nobility, ever prickly, seem oddly cooperative. You start hearing the phrase in the days of King Æthelstan, creep into local disputes, as in the boundary was set thus in the days of King Æthelstan. Or my father swore that oath when Æthelstan reigned. The living king is becoming a measuring stick, a standard, a past tense, and he knows it. You watch him in Gloucester, where he now spends more and more of his time. The court still functions, still sends letters and receives gifts, but there's a softness to the schedule now. He wakes later, his readings are longer. The Psalter never leaves his table. Fringe fact one courtier claims Æthelstan began collecting keys in his final years. Keys from abbey doors, market gates, even manor houses. Not to use, but to catalog. When asked why he allegedly said the man who holds the door should remember how it opens, you notice he speaks more often with monks than nobles now. Discusses not politics but psalms. Asks questions not about taxes or land disputes, but about the soul, about judgment, about whether memory fades in heaven. He still attends councils, still signs laws, but his focus has shifted inward and outward in a different way. He founds churches, funds hospitals, donates land not for alliances but for legacy. One charter gives a plot to a convent on the edge of the Danelaw with the odd instruction, "For the keeping of prayers where swords once ruled." He invites pilgrims, not emissaries. Hosts saints' relics, not foreign suitors. At one point, a cartload of bones arrives from Gaul, accompanied by a letter praising Æthelstan's unfailing devotion to divine memory. He thanks them with a goblet carved from walrus ivory and a psalm copied in gold. Fringe anecdote: a boy at court claims Æthelstan once taught him how to recognize a forged relic by its smell. Bones should smell like time, he said. If they smell like oil, they've been handled too much. He rarely travels far anymore. Gloucester, Malmesbury, Winchester on rare occasions. The rest he leaves to younger men. He trained men who learned not just how to lead, but how to endure. Because that, more than anything, is Æthelstan's gift: endurance. Not just surviving, but persisting quietly, strategically through storms and song. You hear whispers that he's begun arranging his burial. Nothing grand, no marble shrine. He wants to be interred near saints, not in pomp. Specifically at Malmesbury, his favorite abbey, his intellectual refuge, the place he once prayed beside St. Aldhelm's bones as a young man. Historians still argue why he chose Malmesbury over Winchester, the traditional royal tomb. Some say it was humility. Others think it was a statement, a deliberate shift towards spiritual legacy over dynastic pride. You hear him speak of it once. "I'd rather be remembered by monks than remembered by mistake." The court accepts his slower rhythm. Some nobles leave sensing opportunity elsewhere. Others stay waiting for the inevitable. And yet there's no decline, no collapse, just a leveling. As if the kingdom itself is taking a long breath. You attend one last council in Gloucester. Æthelstan sits beneath a wide window, sunlight catching the streaks in his hair. The topic is a minor border dispute. He listens, offers a short ruling, then calls for the Psalter. The council waits as he recites a passage, Psalm 89, you think. Something about steadfast love and the throne of David. He doesn't explain. He doesn't need to. Everyone in the room knows what he's doing. He's reminding them that all of this, the laws, the battles, the roads, the coins, the poetry, is not just policy, it's inheritance. He stands, dismisses the council, walks out of the room. Later, a young courtier asks you what Æthelstan did in his final years. You think for a moment, then answer, "He taught us what to do when the noise stops." Because it has. There's no war. There's no rebellion. Just a king who has finally come to rest. Not by withdrawing, but by completing. There's something different in the light now. It drapes across the court like linen, pale, quiet, soft at the edges. The gold of victory has faded into the gray-blue of legacy. You feel it in the hallways of Gloucester. in the echo of boots that no longer rush. In the conversations which now start with when he was younger, Æthelstan is still here, still king, still sharp, but he knows the end of the story is near. You sit with him one morning beneath an open window, parchment on his lap, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the corners. He asks you, "What do you think happens to laws that are never read again?" You give some half-thought reply about precedent and scribes. He smiles. They die, and he's not ready to let his kingdom forget how it was made. So he sets about securing memory, not through war, not through show, through portraiture and parchment. Æthelstan begins commissioning depictions of his reign. Nothing overly grand, no stained glass cathedrals in his likeness, no statues with swords raised, but tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, painted panels. Art not of him slaying dragons, but of him holding scrolls, offering gifts, presiding over councils. The kind of images that say, "This was a king who built." Fringe fact. One miniature painted in Winchester depicts Æthelstan in profile with the hawk on his wrist, a nod to his love of falconry. But another less polished version shows him surrounded by monks, his crown askew and one shoe untied. Some believe this was a scribe's private joke. Others think it was just real. He also curates charters, not new ones, but copies of old ones, carefully bound and catalogued. You see him dictating names, dates, even correcting his own earlier rulings. It's as if he's pruning the vines of his own myth, snipping away exaggeration to leave only what matters. You pass a stack one evening. The top reads "Boundaries set at Tamworth, witnessed by bishops and sky." That last part catches your eye. It's not poetic. It's literal. It rained that day. The sky was witness. His understanding of kingship hasn't dimmed, it's deepened. You watch him meet with younger noble sons of the men who once followed him into battle. He speaks not of war, but of restraint. He warns them strength is loud, rule is quiet. Some listen, one doesn't. You hear later that the man was denied a land grant? No anger, just denial. Æthelstan has no time left for those who still think a crown is just a weapon turned sideways. The clergy adore him. And not just for the gifts, though there are many even now. Manuscripts bound in whalebone, bells cast from melted sword hilts. One abbey receives a cross embedded with tiny glass beads said to have been brought from Rome, though more likely purchased in Dorset. Fringe anecdote: in his final year, Æthelstan is said to have blessed every door in a small chapel, personally 27 in total. It took him 2 hours. When asked why, he said, "If you bless only the altar, the mice run wild." He writes fewer letters now, but when he does, they carry weight. You read one sent to the court of the young Louis of France. It opens with a line you don't expect. "The storm has passed, and yet we still wear our cloaks," a warning and a kindness. And then, without announcement, he prepares to leave. Not for war, not for progress, for Malmesbury. You travel with him. The procession is quiet, no fanfare. Just a slow line of riders and carts carrying scrolls, robes, books, and one small wooden chest. The abbey welcomes him like a returning saint. He walks through its halls not as a king, but as a student. Pauses at Aldhelm's tomb again. Prays silently for a long time. The monks don't disturb him. You notice a change in his posture. He walks more upright than before, as though shedding the weight of the crown gave him his height back. He settles in a simple chamber. Wooden beams, cold floor, no canopy bed. Just a stool, a candle, and a psalter. His favorite! You hear whispers in the abbey that he's begun giving things away. Rings, coins. Even one of his personal belts, yes, perhaps even that belt, is handed to a young monk in case the rule becomes heavy. He attends service daily, eats simply, occasionally smiles. When a delegation from Winchester arrives to urge him to return, he simply says, It's time for another kind of king. They don't press him. Historians still debate why he left court so completely. Some call it abdication in all but name. Others say he wanted to die near the saints. Or perhaps he just knew the silence would speak louder than any final decree. Fringe fact: in the final months, Æthelstan supposedly wrote a single line of poetry each morning and gave it to the scriptorium. Only two survive. One reads, "A crown is a question carved in gold," and then one morning the bell tolls long before sunrise. Æthelstan has died. No fanfare, no final proclamation, just stillness. He is buried at Malmesbury, not in a grand royal tomb, but beneath a slab bearing only his name and a prayer for mercy. His body is wrapped in plain linen, his psalter placed beside him. The monks say the light through the chapel window that morning was the softest they'd ever seen. You remain behind as the court packs up, not because there's more to see, but because there's so much to remember. You remain in Malmesbury long after the court departs. The hallways feel wider now. Not emptier, just quieter. The kind of quiet that clings to stone after a voice has left it. Æthelstan's chamber is sealed. His psalter has been moved to the scriptorium. His name is still whispered in morning prayers. And outside beyond the cloisters, the kingdom carries on. No riots, no rebellion, no scrambling for power. The transition happens with astonishing smoothness. His half-brother Edmund ascends to the throne without quarrel. Not because everyone loved him, but because Æthelstan prepared the ground. You begin to realize the legacy is not what he built in life. It's what survives now that he's gone. You travel again, retracing old steps, seeing the kingdom not through banners and oaths, but residue. The afterglow of 20 years of silent design. You stop at a monastery in Exeter. A young monk shows you a psalter copied 5 years ago. He runs his fingers over the gilded initials and says, "The king said, 'Beauty makes memory linger.' At a market near York, you buy bread with a silver coin still bearing Æthelstan's face." The baker shrugs. They last longer than the new ones. In a hall in Mercia, a reeve settles a border dispute by citing one of Æthelstan's old charters. When asked if he's sure of its accuracy, he replies he didn't make sloppy lines. Historians still argue how much of this was deliberate. Did Æthelstan really plan for this seamless continuity? Or did he simply rule so thoroughly that his absence felt like presence? You think of something he once said, "If the house is built well, you don't have to hold the roof after the rain." And the roof is holding. You visit churches that still sing psalms he favored. See schools where boys still trace Latin letters on slates the king paid for. In Malmesbury, they've begun reading excerpts from his law codes aloud during Lent. Not as punishment, as reminder. Fringe detail: a scribe in Kent claims Æthelstan's ghost once corrected his Latin during a nightmare. The poor man woke up and rewrote the entire page. You find the story ridiculous until you see the page and the Latin is flawless. And then you return to York. Not as part of a campaign, but as a pilgrim. You walk through streets that once bristled with defiance. Now the market is calm. The church is repaired. The language still carries Norse edges, but there's no tension in it, just tone. You pause at a small public square where once a king arrived at dawn and left without battle. A boy is carving something into the earth with a stick. You ask him what he's writing. Æthelstan. You ask if he knows who that is. He shrugs. The king that made everything work. You ask what that means. He doesn't know, but he's not wrong. Because Æthelstan's fingerprints are everywhere but faintly. Not in statues or towering monuments, but in the systems, the rhythms, the quiet agreements that no longer need to be enforced because they've become habit. Fringe anecdote: a traveler from the Frankish kingdom once wrote that Æthelstan's realm smelled of bread parchment and confidence. Not exactly the highest prose, but oddly accurate. You begin to understand now. All those laws, the libraries, the schools, The oaths, the marriages, the relics, the poetry, the roads. It wasn't just rule. It was ritual. Ritual turned into structure. Structure turned into nation. You return to Malmesbury one final time. The slab is still there, the same quiet prayer chiseled into the stone. A monk kneels nearby whispering the psalms. You recognize the rhythm. Psalm 89 again. His favorite. You kneel too. Not for religion necessarily, but for recognition. Because whatever England becomes, whatever kings rise, whatever wars break, whatever saints are forgotten, this man built the template. The first king who ruled not just people, but process. Not just today, but tomorrow. As you rise, the sun angles through the high window and glints across the stone floor. The world feels steady. Not perfect, but steady, and that's enough. You find yourself tracing rivers now. From the Thames to the Tyne, from the Severn to the Ouse, you follow the waterways that thread through the land like memory. Æthelstan understood rivers not just as transport routes or borders, but as lines that connect. Channels of flow, of influence, of permanence. Because even long after his death, the kingdom continues to echo with his cadence. In the towns, people still measure distance in terms of the King's Road, even when the road has long since vanished beneath moss and cobbles. In the abbeys, prayers still open with a phrase older than memory, as in the days of our first High King. He is gone, and yet he isn't. You visit the archives in Winchester, where a scribe leads you to a low stone room, lined with documents, charters, council records, letters bearing seals worn thin by centuries of hands. At least a third are from Æthelstan's reign. Neatly folded, meticulously annotated. They still teach from them. Not out of reverence necessarily, but because they still work. The boundaries he drew still mostly honored. The legal formulas still recognizable. The structure of councils, the expectations of rulers, even the tone of state language, it all still carries the faint aftertaste of Æthelstan's pen. Historians continue to dig. Not literally, although they've certainly tried, but through documents, marginalia chronicles half-burned in monastery fires. Each one turns up some new fragment, a scribe's note, a line of policy, a whispered rumor turned law. Fringe fact, one document uncovered in the 12th century includes a faint doodle in the margin what appears to be Æthelstan, seated beside a lion. Possibly allegorical, possibly symbolic, possibly just an overzealous monk misinterpreting a cat. The chroniclers begin to shape him differently over time. At first he's remembered simply as the victorious. Later, he becomes the wise. Then, curiously, the mirror of kings. A phrase that appears again and again in different manuscripts, always in different contexts, always in admiration. You begin to see it clearly. Æthelstan has become an archetype. Not just a king who ruled well, a model for how a king should rule. Even William of Malmesbury, writing nearly 200 years after Æthelstan's death, called him the first true king of all England. He wrote that Æthelstan was gentle in peace, invincible and war-wise in counsel, pure in life. Perhaps a touch exaggerated, but only a touch. Even more impressive, he had no sons, no bloodline to press his name forward. His legacy doesn't ride on dynasty. It rides on memory, on systems, on culture, on the slow, steady accretion of habits that outlive their maker. You revisit the treasury in London, what little of it remains, and see coins still bearing his face. Not many now worn smooth. But when you hold one in your hand, you realize how deliberately he chose his symbols, the scepter, the crown, the Latin inscription about God's grace. Fringe anecdote, one sailor swore he once found an Æthelstan coin inside a hollow mast beam in a Viking shipwreck. When asked how it got there, he shrugged and said, "Maybe even they kept it for luck." You begin to notice references in odd places. An Irish poem makes a strange mention of the king, who sang with his sword. A Breton letter refers to a gift from the English Caesar. A Saxon abbey includes Æthelstan's name in a list of intercessors alongside saints. And yet for all this, he is nearly forgotten in modern times. Not erased, just faded. Alfred the Great gets the glory. Harold and Hastings take the drama. Henrys and Edwards fill the stage. But Æthelstan, he's the blueprint under the building. Quiet, foundational, holding everything in place. You walk once more to Malmesbury, where the slab remains unadorned. The inscription is simple. No list of titles, no boast of victories, just a name and a request for mercy. You meet an old monk sweeping the cloister walk. He hums as he works. When you ask about Æthelstan, he nods thoughtfully and says he made it possible to forget him. Because he made things work so well. You stand there for a long time. Because it's true. And also tragic. And also, right. Because Æthelstan didn't build a kingdom to be worshipped. He built it to be used. To outlast noise, to outlast memory. To survive the lazy king, the greedy baron, the forgetful steward. And somehow it does. Even now, you open a charter. It still says, "In the year of grace, under the eye of God by the hand of Æthelstan, king of the English and of all Britain." And though the hand is dust, the words remain. The roads are quiet now. You walk alone more often, no longer flanked by war horses or courtiers, no longer listening to the rustle of royal banners in the wind. Just your boots, the breath of the trees, the occasional bleat of a sheep that likely has no idea how many kingdoms have been born and buried just beyond its field. You're retracing something. Not chasing exactly, but tracing. The shape of a kingdom. And the outline is Æthelstan. You arrive one gray afternoon in a market town modest and bustling. You sit beside a baker whose daughter is learning her letters. She shows you her primer Latin alphabet in black ink, each letter paired with a verse from Psalms. When you ask where the book came from, the baker shrugs. From the school from the church from the abbey, and the abbey, it was built with coin marked Æthelstan Rex. And there he is again, not in stone, not in song, but in infrastructure. In systems that no longer carry his name on their lips but on their bones. He doesn't need to be remembered. He just needs to have been understood. You travel onward to a manor house in the Danelaw, long since integrated with children playing on the old earthworks of a Viking camp. Inside, the steward shows you a land charter preserved in a box beneath the hearth. The seal is cracked. The ink is faded. But the line is still there. By the will of Æthelstan, king of the English, this land is held in good faith for as long as good faith endures. Historians will call this period post-Æthelstan. But you begin to realize there is no post. He never really left. There are 3 kingships in England now. The visible one, the living king in Westminster or Winchester holding court and signing laws. The remembered one, the legends of Arthur and Alfred and holy martyrs passed around by minstrels. And the silent one, the shape Æthelstan gave things. Not the battles, not the charters, not even the coins, but the idea that England is a whole. Not just a collection of tribes, not a border painted thick. A structure, a shared law, a place where the same prayer could be spoken in Cornwall and Northumbria and the same coin accepted in both. Fringe fact. A scholar in the 1300s commenting on property rights in Kent wrote, "This is as it was since the time of the great first king, but didn't name which king." When pressed, he replied, "The one who didn't need reminding. That's Æthelstan. He didn't thunder like Charlemagne, didn't perform piety like St. Louis, didn't swing a sword for show. He just held the line. And when the time came, he let go. Gracefully, quietly, without monument. You return one last time to Malmesbury. The abbey is quiet. A student chants softly in a back chapel. The same slab still rests at the edge of the sanctuary. You run your hand across the stone. It's smoother now, centuries of fingers, of memory made flesh. You sit beside it for a while. Then longer, because this is the end of a story that was never about noise or glory or pageantry. It was about maintenance, about building something so well that no one notices how often it saves them from collapse. Æthelstan, the first king of the English, the king who didn't need to be followed, only imitated. The years have folded into centuries, but you feel Ethelstan's presence like a faint pulse beneath the land itself. Not a thunderous heartbeat, but a steady rhythm, the slow, sure beat of foundation stones settling. You walk the quiet halls of history now, where kings are measured, not by battles won or thrones seized, but by the structures they leave behind. Ethelstan's legacy isn't shouted from towers or carved in grand monuments. It's whispered in law codes traced in the veins of rivers and the margins of manuscripts and the steady toll of cathedral bells. You think of the young boy in Mercia, polishing a golden belt whispering psalms under flickering candlelight. You think of the quiet man who won Brunanburh, not just with sword, but with patience, with policy, with poetry. And you realize this story isn't about an emperor. It's about the first English king, a king who ruled not because he was the loudest, but because he was the most enduring. He built a kingdom on trust as much as on blood, on law as much as on battle, on memory as much as on might. Now, as the light fades and the day softens into night, you close your eyes and hear the echo of his voice, quiet, steady, unyielding. Rule is not the crown or the sword, but the silence that follows when all is done. And with that, you drift. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.